Formula One has always been a sport of fractions, where a tenth of a second can feel like an eternity. But what's unfolding right now behind the paddock doors is less about lap times and more about a high-speed chess match over money, manufacturing, and the sheer audacity of trying to outdevelop your rivals when the rulebook says you can't spend a penny more than the next guy. I've watched this drama bubble up over the last few race weekends, and I have to tell you, the story isn't just about one team flexing its engineering muscle. It's about why the rest of the grid is staring at Ferrari's upgrade cadence like it's a magic trick they can't afford to learn. 10 seconds in, I'm going to make a bold claim right now. Ferrari might be operating so close to the edge of the budget cap that it's forcing every other team principal to do mental gymnastics, and the ripple effect could reshape the championship before the summer break even hits. Over the next 20 seconds, I'll give you the consequence that nobody in the midfield wants to say out loud. If teams like Williams or Aston Martin tried to copy this relentless stream of new parts, their entire operational framework would collapse under the weight of logistics and cost, leaving them worse off than if they just stayed in the garage. I promise to take you inside the meetings, the off-the-record whispers, and the brutally honest admissions from the people who build these cars. And by the end of this report, there's going to be one unanswered question about Ferrari's upgrade philosophy that not even Fred Vasseur addressed directly. And look, the moment this whole thing ignited in my mind was when Toto Wolff, the man who engineered Mercedes' decade of dominance, publicly wondered how on earth the Scuderia was bringing updates race after race without triggering some kind of financial alarm bell. Now, I'm not saying anyone is cheating. According to reports and the carefully chosen words of the people involved, everything is above board. But the fact that Wolff felt compelled to speak up at all tells you this isn't just paddock gossip. It's a genuine strategic conundrum that has everyone rethinking what the budget cap actually means. And here's the part that really hooked me. When Fred Vasseur fired back at Silverstone, he didn't just wave off the accusation, he dropped a little detail about what Ferrari counts as an upgrade. And I realized that half the paddock might be defining the word differently from the other half, which is the kind of linguistic loophole that can make or break a season. So let's rewind to the core of this, because you can't appreciate the pressure cooker we're in without understanding that the 2026 regulations effectively hit the reset button on Formula One's entire development ladder. McLaren had climbed to the top of the old pyramid, but the new rule cycle knocked them down and placed Mercedes right on the throne, with the Woking squad scrambling to rediscover its footing. The fascinating thing about a fresh regulatory era is that the law of diminishing returns gets kicked back to zero, meaning every upgrade you bolt onto the car early on can yield massive chunks of lap time, whereas later in the cycle, you're spending millions just to find half a tenth. Mercedes understood this perfectly and stormed out of the gates looking utterly dominant in those first few flyaway rounds. But quietly, almost stealthily, Ferrari started chipping away back at Maranello, and the results in Spain and Great Britain with Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc standing on the top step weren't flukes. They were the fruits of an upgrade schedule so aggressive it's making rivals question the very fabric of the cost cap. Now, I've been around this paddock long enough to know that when one team suddenly starts hauling significant performance to the track every fortnight, the chatter shifts from admiration to suspicion faster than a pit stop. And Toto Wolff giving voice to that suspicion was less an accusation and more a public airing of what half the team bosses were already muttering in their hospitality units. Wolff didn't use the word cheating, he framed it as a curiosity about whether Ferrari could remain under the cap while updating so frequently. But let's be real here, the subtext was as subtle as a DRS overtake, and it put Fred Vasseur in a position where he either had to reveal sensitive details or brush it off as a misunderstanding. Vasseur chose the latter with a hint of irritation that I actually found pretty relatable. Because imagine your longtime friend in the paddock putting your team under a spotlight that suggests you might be bending the rules, and you have to stand there with a straight face and explain that your so-called upgrades are sometimes just a slight tweak to existing parts rather than a ground-up redesign. According to Vasseur's own words at Silverstone, he found the whole thing a bit weird, and he pointed out the painfully obvious logic that if you can bring performance early in the season, you do it, because a couple of tenths over 5 races is worth far more than a couple of tenths over the final 2 when the titles might already be decided. That's not arrogance, that's basic racing math. But the twist he casually dropped was the notion that sometimes the paddock perceives Ferrari as bringing a big upgrade, when in reality it's just a modification of some parts, nothing else. This is where my journalist instincts started tingling, because if Ferrari is classifying certain component changes as minor modifications, while the outside world labels them upgrades, then the entire cost narrative shifts, and the budget cap accounting becomes as murky as a rainy race at Spa. Now hold that thought, because I want to pull you into the less glamorous side of the grid, the factories that don't have a decade of uninterrupted supply chain relationships and the kind of engineering firepower that can pivot design directions over a single phone call. Williams is the perfect case study, and James Vowles, their team principal, didn't sugarcoat the reality when I listened to his explanation. He essentially admitted that even if Williams had all the money and all the design concepts ready on time, their efficiency level simply isn't at the standard of a team that has been operating as a well-oiled machine for 10 years. And that brutally honest self-assessment is something you rarely hear in a sport built on projecting invincibility. Vowles went further and peeled back the curtain on a problem that most fans never consider. Williams lacked an external supply network at the right level because for years there just weren't the funds to pay for the best suppliers, and those suppliers naturally dedicated their best people and fastest turnaround times to the Mercedes and Ferraris of the world. It's a vicious cycle where the rich teams get richer in capability because they built those relationships over 12 years of uninterrupted investment, and a team like Williams is trying to compress a decade of industrial matchmaking into 2 frantic years while simultaneously designing a car that won't embarrass them on track. Vowles framed it as a loss of efficiency that you can either pay for with more money or more time, and sometimes you have to pull both levers just to tread water. Which is why copying Ferrari's upgrade cadence isn't just difficult for Williams, it's operationally impossible without breaking something fundamental. I'll be honest, hearing that level of candor made me appreciate the invisible war behind the lap times, because while we're all debating whether Ferrari's front wing end plate revision qualifies as a major upgrade, teams like Williams are still trying to make sure their supply chain can deliver a batch of floor stays without a 3-week delay and a cost overrun that would trigger a very uncomfortable conversation with the FIA's cost cap auditors. This isn't about talent. Williams has brilliant engineers and a proud history, but modern Formula One is as much about logistics and supplier management as it is about downforce coefficients. And that's a reality that can't be fixed with a single clever design or a sudden injection of cash. There's a human tendency to think that if one team can do something, everyone should be able to replicate it with enough determination. But Vowles' admission blows that assumption apart and sets up the next chapter of our story beautifully, because it forces us to ask what happens when a team tries a completely different development philosophy under the same financial constraints. Aston Martin is writing that very chapter right now, and their situation is arguably more dramatic than Williams because they found themselves almost anchored to the back of the grid after a start to the season that can only be described as a recurring nightmare, the kind you wake up just before the crash and then realize you're still in the dream. They've scored a single point, and that came through a stroke of inherited fortune at the controversial Monaco Grand Prix in June, a race that deserves its own deep dive someday. But the point I'm driving toward is that Aston Martin hasn't been slapping upgrades on the AMR26 every weekend like Ferrari has. And that wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate strategic choice. Mike Krack, their chief trackside officer, explained this with a calmness that almost belied the panic you'd expect from a team in their position. And what he revealed is that the decision to not bring race after race upgrades was baked into their plan from the very beginning, a plan that requires a long lead time and the kind of multi-dimensional thinking that factors in logistics, production, and the specific technical demands of each circuit. In other words, you can't just show up in Austria, have a miserable weekend, and then magically appear at Silverstone 7 days later with a shiny new floor, because the production pipeline needed to make that happen was set in motion months ago, not in a reactive panic on Sunday evening. Krack basically said each team has its boundary conditions and Aston Martin is working to theirs, which on the surface sounds like a polite way of admitting they couldn't afford the rapid-fire approach even if they wanted to, but I suspect there's more to it.
The intriguing layer beneath his statement is that Aston Martin is preparing a wide-ranging upgrade package for the Hungarian Grand Prix right before the summer break, and that concentrated hit of performance might actually be a smarter play than Ferrari's incremental drip if it transforms the car in one surgical strike, provided, of course, the upgrades correlate with the simulations and don't leave them even more confused. This is where the narrative splits into a fascinating fork. Ferrari's philosophy says give the car tenths as early and as often as possible, even if each step is small, while Aston Martin's philosophy says stockpile your gains and deploy them in a coordinated burst. And both approaches are being forced under the same financial ceiling, so one of them is either smarter with money or redefining what an upgrade costs. Now, I promised you that one unanswered question about Ferrari's approach, and it's not about the legality of their spending, it's about the psychological impact of their communication. When Vasseur brushed off the upgrades as mere modifications of an existing part rather than a capital E upgrade, then the cost allocation suddenly becomes a matter of interpretation rather than a clear line item. This is where my sarcasm gland starts tingling a little, because we've all seen teams
play word games with the regulations for years. Flexible floors that were officially rigid, energy recovery systems that were apparently just clever cooling solutions. So the idea that Ferrari might have found a semantic gray zone in the financial regulations is both entirely plausible and deeply frustrating for anyone trying to compete on a level playing field. That doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. According to the FIA, everything is kosher, but the optics are powerful, and the fact that Toto Wolff, a man whose team once burned through a budget that could fund a small nation, is suddenly the guardian of financial fair play, well, that's the kind of irony that makes Formula One so endlessly entertaining. Yet beneath the banter is a genuine tension that affects every single employee back at the factories, because if Ferrari's interpretation of the cost cap allows them to accelerate their development cadence while others are forced to move slowly, the competitive imbalance will only widen, and the 2026 season risks turning into a one-team parade, which is the exact scenario the budget cap was supposed to prevent. The midfield teams understand this better than anyone, and what I'm about to share next is the part of the conversation that rarely makes the headlines, but is arguably the most important, the human cost of this development race. See, when James Vowles talks about building a supply network and Mike Krack talks about boundary conditions, they're really talking about people, the engineers and machinists and logistics coordinators who are already working unsustainable hours to keep these cars on track. And if the pace of upgrades becomes the new baseline, the strain on those human beings will eventually translate into mistakes, burnout, and a dangerous erosion of the very talent that keeps the sport alive. I've spoken to enough people off the record to know that some team members are already looking at the Ferrari model with a mixture of admiration and dread, because they know their own organizations simply don't have the structural resilience to match that tempo. And the last thing Formula One needs is a quiet mental health crisis behind the glamour of the paddock. This angle isn't meant to be sensational, it's meant to ground the entire conversation in reality, because while we can debate whether a new floor stay counts as an upgrade, the person machining that part at 2 a.m. doesn't care about the semantics, they care about whether their family sees them this month. And that brings us into the final stretch of this investigation, because once you layer the human element on top of the financial regulations and the logistical nightmares, you start to see the 2026 season as a massive social experiment disguised as a motorsport championship. Ferrari has clearly chosen the path of relentless iteration. Mercedes is having to respond while simultaneously questioning the math. Red Bull is quietly ramping up its own updates after a sluggish start, and the rest of the grid is essentially picking a philosophy that won't bankrupt their operational capabilities or their people. I've noticed something fascinating in the timing. Ferrari's victories in Spain and Great Britain didn't just deliver points, they delivered a statement that the incremental approach works, and that statement echoes through the factories like a challenge that every other team principal now has to answer to their board and their shareholders. But I want to leave you with a thought that Fred Vasseur himself might find uncomfortable, because his claim that these upgrades are just modifications doesn't fully address the suspicion that the frequency of those modifications is itself an indication of a development budget that's being stretched across more cycles than the cap intended to accommodate.
According to reports and the paddock chatter I've absorbed, the key unknown isn't the per-part cost, it's the overhead of changing your production line that many times over a season. Because every time you alter a component, you're incurring costs beyond the raw materials. There's quality control, there's recertification, there's the opportunity cost of tying up machines that could have been building spares for reliability. If Ferrari has somehow streamlined those hidden costs through clever accounting or genuinely superior process efficiency, then they've earned their advantage fair and square. But if there's even a hint of creative bookkeeping, the whole budget cap framework starts to look as stable as a car with asymmetric brake bias. I'm not alleging wrongdoing, I'm pointing out that the current system relies heavily on self-reporting and retrospective audits that often happen months after the checkered flag. And by the time any discrepancies are found, the championship trophies have already been engraved and the celebrations are a distant memory. That temporal gap between action and accountability is where the skepticism breeds, and it's why every statement from a team principal about upgrades is parsed like a legal deposition. The real story, the one that will dominate the second half of the season, is whether the FIA can develop a real-time oversight mechanism that matches the speed of development. Because right now, we're in a weird space where the on-track action is breathtaking, but the off-track monitoring feels like it's running on dial-up internet. I'll end this report where I began, with the unanswered question that I believe will define the 2026 narrative. If Ferrari can sustain this upgrade tempo all the way to Abu Dhabi without triggering a single cost cap violation, what does that say about the effectiveness of the rules? And what does it mean for the smaller teams, who are already fighting with one hand tied behind their backs? The answer won't come from a press conference soundbite. It will come from the auditor's reports that none of us will see until next February. And until then, every new part bolted onto the SF26 will carry the weight of suspicion, justified or not. That's not a comfortable position for the sport to be in, but it's undeniably captivating, and I'll be watching every Friday practice.
Session like a detective, because somewhere in those garage shots, if you look closely enough, you might just spot the truth hiding in plain sight, wrapped in carbon fiber and sealed with a Maranello stamp. What makes this situation even more fascinating is that Ferrari's rivals are no longer whispering quietly behind closed doors. Team principals are becoming increasingly careful with their wording, but the underlying message is impossible to miss. Every time Ferrari arrives at a circuit with another floor update, another cooling solution, another suspension tweak, or another aerodynamic refinement, the same question immediately spreads through the paddock. Where is all this development capacity coming from? In an era supposedly designed to prevent runaway spending, Ferrari somehow appears capable of operating with the urgency and freedom of a pre-cost cap giant while remaining fully within the framework of the regulations. Of course, suspicion alone is not evidence. That distinction matters. Formula One has a long history of teams accusing rivals of bending rules simply because they cannot match their performance. Dominance often creates paranoia. We saw it during Red Bull's peak years. We saw it during Mercedes' hybrid-era reign. We saw it when Ferrari itself was under scrutiny in previous seasons. Success attracts attention, and attention inevitably attracts allegations. Yet there is something different about the current conversation, because it is not focused on a single controversial component or a clever interpretation of a technical directive. Instead, it is focused on the scale and frequency of Ferrari's development cycle itself. That is where the pressure on the FIA becomes enormous. Fans can accept losing. Teams can accept being beaten by a superior car. What becomes difficult to accept is uncertainty. The moment competitors begin questioning whether the playing field is being monitored effectively, confidence in the system starts to erode. The FIA may ultimately conclude that Ferrari has done absolutely nothing wrong, but even that outcome will not fully resolve the issue unless the governing body can demonstrate how it reached that conclusion and why everyone should trust it. Meanwhile, Ferrari will likely argue that its achievements are being unfairly diminished. From their perspective, engineers have spent countless hours in simulation, manufacturing departments have optimized every process, strategists have maximized every opportunity, and drivers have extracted every fraction of performance available. If the team has genuinely found a way to outdevelop the competition while staying inside every financial and technical boundary, then perhaps the real story is not about a loophole at all. Perhaps it's about operational excellence on a level the rest of the grid simply hasn't matched. That possibility should not be ignored. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Maybe Ferrari has discovered efficiencies that others missed. Maybe years of restructuring behind the scenes are finally paying off. Maybe the team that once seemed trapped in a cycle of inconsistency has finally assembled the right combination of leadership, engineering talent, and strategic direction. If that is true, then history may look back on this period not as a controversy, but as the moment Ferrari mastered the cost cap era better than anyone else. But until transparency catches up with performance, the debate will continue. Every upgrade package will be analyzed. Every new piece of bodywork will be photographed from every angle. Every aerodynamic tweak will generate another round of speculation, and every strong race weekend will add fuel to a discussion that refuses to disappear. That is why the next few months could be as important off the track as they are on it. Championships are usually decided by lap times, tire management, strategy calls, and driver execution. This one may also be shaped by perception, scrutiny, and trust. Ferrari has put itself in a position where every success story immediately becomes an investigation story. Fair or unfair, that is the reality of being the team everyone is chasing. And if the SF26 keeps finding speed while the rest of the field struggles to keep pace, the questions will only grow louder. Because Formula One has always thrived on mystery, but it survives on credibility. The sport can handle controversy, it can handle fierce rivalries. What it cannot afford is a lingering sense that nobody truly knows where the line is being drawn. That is the tension hanging over this championship fight. And by the time the season reaches its final laps under the lights of Abu Dhabi, the battle for the title may be half the story. The other half will be the search for answers that the entire paddock has been chasing since the first signs of Ferrari's remarkable surge appeared on the horizon.